Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that little hint. Okay, so we have over 70 people signed up for this session, and I'm so thrilled. Each time we do these conversations, the numbers grow, which I guess is the whole point of it. And we're just able to talk about topics that aren't often talked about in a very candid way. And because we have such a large audience, later on, we're going to be able to have everyone put questions in the chat room, and we are going to answer as many questions as possible. So basically, what I'm asking is if anyone wants to put in there where they're coming in from, where they live, and what organization they're with, that would be awesome. And if anyone wants to put on their camera, it just helps me because I can see your faces and I can connect that way. I wish we were doing it in person, but I'm glad we were able to do it this way. So basically what the next hour and 15 minutes is going to be about is I'm going to tell you my story, why I'm doing this, and what's happened to our family over the last 14 years. I'm going to introduce Jenny, my guest, and welcome, Jenny. I really am so happy to see you here. And Jenny will tell her story. We'll ask each other some questions, have a great conversation, and then we'll answer any questions that you guys have. So I want to respect your time. So I'll get started. We are recording it, and I'll be able to send out that recording afterwards. Let's see. And just a housekeeping rule that if you're able to keep yourself on mute, that would be the best thing to avoid any distractions. And again, feel free to put on your cameras. So I'm recording. I want to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, I've been in the grief space for the past 14 years, unfortunately, or fortunately. 14 years ago, I'll tell you a little bit about my personal story so you can get grounded in why I'm doing what I'm doing. My family lives in a suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and in 2009, we had 3 daughters, Laura, Sarah, and Rachel. They were 14, 12, and 9 at the time. And my oldest daughter, Laura, began complaining of headaches in her freshman first semester in January. We didn't think too much of it. We gave her some Tylenol because headaches are a common symptom of teenagers, and she was pretty stressed out with first semester exams. The headaches really didn't improve, and I started getting a little bit concerned, but then she went to a pediatrician who gave a little neurological exam, and everything seemed fine. And then the headaches came back. And so on a Tuesday evening, she slept in my bed because my husband was traveling. And on Wednesday morning, while I was getting ready, she threw up several times in our bed. And she asked me why I had 4 eyes. And then within the next 30 minutes, she had a seizure in our upstairs hallway. So we called 911. She woke up and she was rushed to the hospital, where about an hour later, she had a CAT scan done, and a doctor came into the waiting room or to the emergency room area and told me that Laura had a mass at the back of her head. And I remember thinking, okay, this is not good news, but it's going to get removed and it'll be benign and she'll recover and everything will go back to being okay, because that's how things had gone in our life up to that point. Later that afternoon, the surgeon did an MRI and said the tumor can be removed, and she'll have brain surgery in 2 days on a Friday when the operating room would become available. So we thought, okay, this is really bad, but there's going to be progress and it's going to get removed. Well, she was put into a double room, and the headaches became a lot more painful for her, and they tried giving her some more pain medicine. And all of a sudden we were in the room and she stopped breathing. They quickly rushed her down to put a shunt in her head to relieve the brain pressure. And when the surgeon came out of the operating room, he said that the procedure had gone okay, but that she wasn't responding the way they'd like. And the next thing we know, we were being taken up to the ICU room, where Laura was hooked up to really every machine and tube and wire that you could imagine. And as a mom, I knew that she wasn't there anymore. And this was really ridiculous because she had been in school the day before complaining about her headaches, but also complaining about her Spanish homework, and had never really spent a day in the hospital. And here we were 18 hours later on a Wednesday evening, and she was basically on life support. So, things like this don't usually happen, but it was happening to us. And 3 days later of us sleeping at the hospital and waiting for the doctors to tell us what was going on, they did a final MRI on Saturday morning, and the surgeon told us that she had suffered basically irreparable brain damage because she had stopped breathing, and the brain had gotten a lack of oxygen, that the tumor had gotten too big, had pressed on her brainstem to stop her breathing. So to make it's a very long story, shorter, we had just survived. We'd just been told what we had feared, but never ever wanted to believe. And so we were just thrust from being a private family in Milwaukee to being a very public facing family. And we were now the family whose daughter had died very suddenly from a rare childhood brain tumor. So we really had to figure out how we were going to go forward from there. And, it's hard to describe the grief and the shock and the despair in this short of a time, but we had to just decide that we weren't going to sacrifice the lives of our other two daughters, who were 12 and 9 at the time, to this loss. We didn't want to live without Laura, but we felt like we just didn't have a choice. You think that stories on the news are just stories on the news until something like that happens to you. So this was our new reality. And, we'll be talking over the next hour about how we managed, but really the upshot is we needed to train and model for other people how we wanted to be treated, because we didn't know what it meant to be grieving parents. Were we supposed to wear black for the rest of our lives? How were we supposed to keep parenting our children who were in the school system? How could we be courageous enough to even go outside of our home and get the kinds of stares and looks of pity that we got at Starbucks? And we had to learn that we wanted people to talk about Laura, and we wanted people to remember that we were her proud parents, even though she was no longer with us. And we needed to keep mentioning Laura's name and keeping her legacy alive. So that's what we did. And I learned so much about grief. And now my entire social media feed is full of grief posts and resilience posts and all sorts of things related to these topics that I never thought about at all prior to Laura's passing. And so that's where I'm coming from. And I started, I learned that even the most educated people don't know some of the basics of grief, and everyone seems to want to know what should they say and what should they do for friends and family who are experiencing a loss. And so this is giving me meaning and purpose to do these conversations about grief and resilience and organ donation and growth following a trauma. So in this grief space, I came across Jenny, who has a specific story that she'd like to share. And I think between the two of us, we really can cover a lot of ground. Jenny Jenny is someone who I met about a year and a half ago, and through some grief-related acquaintances. And she's written a book about her experience that she never expected to have. And I'll read her bio, and then we'll kind of go from there. So Jenny is an award-winning author and widowed mom who is dedicated to helping widowed parents increase their family's well-being. In her book, Future Widow, Jenny draws on her personal and professional experience to provide a real-life guide for surviving and thriving while raising grieving children. As host of the Widowed Parent podcast, Jenny has done more than 100 interviews with experts, seasoned widowed parents, and people who lost a parent at a young age. Her podcast brings much-needed resources to parents, helping them feel less lost and alone. Jenny's work has been featured in the Washington Post and Parent Map. She lives in Redmond, Washington with her 2 teenagers. And as you're going to find out toward the end of the hour, she's involved in so many other things as well, a children's book and creating another book to help widowed parents with some tips. So I would love to kind of start out the conversation by really asking Jenny to tell us about her story and about what happened to begin her journey into this grief space. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to this. And I made a few notes while you were talking. There's like, I don't know, 10 different things you said that I was like, yeah, we had that too, but in an entirely different context, right? So you're talking about your daughter. I'm talking about my husband, Dennis. He was 44, so still far too young. And not an age when you expect someone's going to die, obviously, right? I mean, we never know, but you expect you're going to live the rest of your life with this person, and you expect that the rest of your life is a bunch of more decades. So this started, I was thinking about it was 8 years ago next week. And you were talking about, in your situation, everything being perfectly normal. Laura was saying I have too much Spanish homework. In my situation, everything was perfectly normal. Dennis worked at City Hall. I worked for a large tech company. We had 2 kids in grade school. We were doing scouts and soccer and all the things, a dog and a cat and a house in the suburbs, right? Like your life was just normal, unremarkable. He didn't have any health issues that we knew about. And then he started feeling a little dizzy. So I'm thinking, right, Laura has a headache. You could have a headache for a million reasons. You didn't drink enough water. You're too stressed about school. You didn't sleep enough. You could be dizzy. You didn't drink enough water. I don't know, whatever. You're tired. Just thinking it's no big deal, right? But it was the weirdest thing, because soon after that, I started noticing these subtle cognitive confusion, but intermittent, right? So when it started, it was a Friday night. I dropped my son off at this Boy Scout thing for the weekend, come home with my daughter. He's sitting on the couch, and I walk in and he's got this look on his face, like something was wrong. And I actually thought maybe like he had a bad day at work or something, right? Like, hey, what's up? What's going on? Well, I've been feeling a little dizzy lately. So we had this whole discussion, we sit down like, okay, what are you feeling? How often is it happening? This, right? And I'm like, let's get to the bottom of this. And since it was a Friday night, there was nobody to call. I mean, if he'd been seizing or passing out or, all kinds of things, maybe I would have taken him to the hospital or called 911, but he was just a little dizzy. So, okay, let's call your doctor Monday. Let's get on top of this, right? So, but then still Friday night, we're ready to crash, right? Long week. I'm going to go get takeout. I come back. So it's been like 20 minutes, right? I'm like, how you doing? Right? Like, I'm like, oh, like, I'm on top of this. And he looks at me, he's like, oh, I'm doing okay. But I've been feeling a little dizzy lately. And I looked at him and I was like, you just told me that. And he said, I did. Yeah, we're sitting on the couch right here. I replayed, right, what had just happened. And he said, really? Like, okay, this is too weird. Like, what, is he pulling my leg? But then he was totally normal. So it was just this subtle stuff, right? And I'm like, so meanwhile, I'm watching him and I start Googling, right? Like, what could possibly be going on here? And he was taking this on just medicine that he'd started taking recently for just a urinary blockage. And so I'm Googling that. And one of the rare side effects was cognitive confusion. So I was convinced, okay, we're going to call the doctor. We're going to say, he's been saying these crazy things. And the doctor's going to say, oh yeah, that medicine must be the cause. We'll change it. And this will just be, something we look back on and not laugh exactly, but like unremarkable. Well, the doctor, this is primary care now, says, why don't we do an MRI? And so they send us downstairs for the MRI. And, I've had MRIs for knee surgeries and things. And normally they do it and they call you in 2 days, right? Well, and that's what they initially said would be the plan. Well, at the end of the MRI, they bring him back out and they say, actually, why don't you go back upstairs now because the doctor wants to see you now? Keep in mind, it's after 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, right? Like I don't know what this is, but this is bad. So the doctor says, well, there's something really wrong with your brain. I don't want to scare you. It might be glioblastoma. Meanwhile, I'm like, glioblastoma, what's that? Right? Never heard the word ever. You need to go see the neurosurgeon tomorrow. So we go to the neurosurgeon the next day, and he says, we're doing surgery the following day. So this is, all of a sudden, just from normal to, brain surgery in not very much time. And so, speaking of everything shifting so quickly, right? Then we had an extended 8 months until he died. But it turns out glioblastoma is an extremely aggressive brain cancer with a low 5-year survival rate, like in the single digits. And it also turns out that I did know some people who had some kind of family, like my neighbor's husband died of it, but I didn't know that at the time. Right? I knew that he had died, but I didn't know that neighbor. But anyway, it turns out it's the same brain cancer. And so that was really the start. But like you said, in the beginning, it was a tumor, right? We didn't know that it was brain cancer.
Right.
Some tumors are fixable.
I think we have a similar situation Laura's was an aggressive, rare childhood brain tumor, which is very aggressive. And really, we learned that she really couldn't have survived more than a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And it's the same thing where glioblastomas have a very, it's not a good diagnosis. But
exactly. It's basically a death sentence, this glioblastoma. Now, that being said, I know a couple of people who have had glioblastoma and are alive 20 years later, which is amazing. But those are very small numbers of people.
Right. Well, and so what was it like taking care of your husband while he was ill?
Mm-hmm. Well, I could go a million different directions with that one. So it was a period of 8 months. So there was logistical problems. There was medical chaos, right? So we had, in this period, I would maybe divide it into 3 periods. The first period was all this medical chaos. I think there was 1 week where we went to the ER like 4 or 5 times in the same week, right? He was, in the hospital or in the skilled nursing facility most of the time in that first, I don't know, couple of months. Sometimes discharged, sent right back, things like that. Then the second period, he was home for a while, a couple of months maybe. And we had home nurses, home PT, home OT, I think, coming to do things with him at the house. And then the final period was a hospice period, and that was a few months at the end. But this was, it was a time where by the last few months, he had diapers that I had to change. They don't tell you about these things, right? Like you imagine when someone's on hospice, or you imagine when someone's bedridden. Well, when someone's bedridden, well, they still, if they're eating or drinking, which they need to be, then they got to go to the bathroom somehow, right? And they put a Foley catheter in, which handled that part, but someone's still going to poop. So, right, there's all these like real things that, hospice brings diapers, and then they give you the gloves and they're like, okay, good luck, right? And I also I don't think I knew, you think hospice, there's going to be people, and there were people, but like the nurse came once a week, and then towards the end, she started coming more often, as it was needed. And the caregiver, or the nurse's aide, came daily for a while, and then 3 times a week to do like bath time or whatever, like some, that kind of thing. But the rest of the 24/7, hospice isn't there. Right? You need a caregiver, and that ended up being me. And we had these 2 kids at the same time.
Right. How did you manage that?
Yeah, well, so they were, by the time he died, they were 9 and 11. I'm thinking back to what I just said. I had these two kids, we had these two kids. Like, is it an I or a we? Well, it was a we, there are kids, but I was like immediately a single parent because of the way the brain cancer was affecting him cognitively. He wasn't doing any parenting. There was no like, let's do a bucket list of things. There was no meaningful discussions. There was no like, oh, let's have dad give some kind of, I don't know, make memories with the kids or, leave advice or anything like that. So I was parenting the two of them and him, essentially. I mean, I was caregiving for him, but it was very much a different role than, a regular adult marriage relationship. As far as the kids, I had a lot of help on the logistical aspects. So the carpools to soccer practice, the carpools to school, the let's make sure they have lunch at school every day, the let's have, people are bringing dinners on the meal train and someone's going to a birthday party and, oh, some other parent magically arranges to pick my kid up and get a gift and have my kid sign the card and go. So I didn't have to worry about like all the logistical stuff. And anytime I needed to go to the hospital, which was frequent and also unpredictable when I might go or how long I might be there, I had plenty of people who were helping, with those things. What I wish I'd known or figured out how to make time for somehow. I mean, I feel like I was managing so many things. And I think I was kind of feeling like, okay, the kids, like, they're getting to school and they're getting taken care of. So they're kind of fine. Maybe I use in air quotes. And on one level they were, because they were getting to school and soccer practice and things. And it's a fine line because I'm not beating myself up about it because I know I was doing the best I could. And also I wish I had known more at the time to go in and start opening some conversations with them sooner about like the emotional side of things, because I think that would have set us up better in the longer run. So, right. Like, but at the end of the day, by the time, one kid's in bed, the other kid's in bed, Dennis is in bed, the dog's been put out or, whatever, and he's had his nighttime shot and his nighttime diaper change, his nighttime medicine, I'm falling into bed, right? And I wish I had opened some of those conversations with the kids, like, hey, how's this going for you having dad home in the hospital bed, completely bedridden and limited interactions? All the kids could really do with him was like sit there and watch TV with him. Not with any meaningful discussion about the TV show, just watching,
I mean, it sounds like your plate was quite full, and now with the hindsight and after talking to all of these experts that you brought on, your podcast and researching when you did your book, like what would you want? Can you distill down a couple things, what you would want a widowed parent to know prior to the parent dying or during that illness period? I know that we're jumping ahead, but maybe you can say a couple of them and then we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, if people have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll get to those when it's appropriate. I think one of the most important things that I've learned is how important it is to be honest with kids about death and grief and illness and loss. And even when it's difficult, or maybe especially when it's difficult, right? Nobody wants to talk about these things. But one of the things that I, early on, as I said, we knew it was a tumor and we didn't know yet that it was cancerous and that they couldn't fix it. But we found that out, after the biopsy came back. And I had posted on Caring Bridge an update because we had a lot of people who were following along. And so my friend called me up and she said, our kids, she said, when are you going to tell your kids about the diagnosis? And I think she could tell that I was hoping to be like, well, never, like, right. Or maybe, I don't know, but stick my head in the sand and not now. And she said, here's the thing. We updated our kids tonight that, there's this diagnosis, and they asked if he was going to die. And we didn't want to lie to them. And we said, yes, we don't know when, but the doctors can't fix it. And she said, this conversation is probably happening at dinner tables all across the school community tonight. Your kids need to hear this from you tonight, not tomorrow on the playground. And I was like, oh, man, okay, you're right, but no, like, and so, but she was totally, absolutely right. And that's the kind of the fact, like, if I had not told them and everybody else around them knew, that might have kind of seemed okay in the short run, because maybe they would have been, not burdened by that fact in the short run. But in the long run, I think it would have created a lot more problems. For example, I interviewed somebody whose wife had cancer and died, and the kids were teenagers, and they somehow didn't feel they were old enough to know, like, that their mother was going to die. And this was a number of years. So in the beginning, like, that there was hope that there were cures or treatments and things. But towards the end, it was concluded that it was uncurable and she would be dying. And they didn't tell the youngest child, who by that time was like in high school. But their community knew. So the girl's friends knew, because the girl's friends' parents knew, and the girl's friends' parents told her. So the girl found out, like, I think it was maybe they finally told the kids, like, a week before she died or something, that she would be dying. And the girl was upset and went to her friend and was like, talking to her friend, and the friend was like, it became obvious that the friend knew and had known for a while. And this upset the girl even more, that other people knew. And so I guess the point being that the bond of trust between the kids and the surviving parent is incredibly important. Not only for its own sake, it is important for its own sake. And also, it turns out, and this is the really interesting part, as a pattern for future trusting, intimate relationships that child may develop over their lifetime, be they partners, colleagues, friends, right? That pattern, if the bond of trust between the surviving parent and the child is broken because the parent hasn't leveled with them, it can set up all kinds of problems. And so these are some of the things that I've learned that I think it's really important for parents to know, because as a parent, I was a parent with, like, regular kid issues up to that point, like, homework wrangling, sibling rivalry, potty training, just regular stuff. And it felt like, okay, I don't know what to do here. And I feel like, in a certain case, I could do A or B, and one of those has got to be right or better than the other, but I don't know which. And it feels really fraught if I choose the wrong one, but I don't know who can even tell me which one to choose.
Well, that really resonates with me, because I remember in the weeks or months after Laura passing away, I remember going to a local bookstore and looking at the racks, the shelves of books that were about grief, trying to find that one book that spoke to me, that would tell me what to do when your 14-year-old daughter dies very suddenly from an undiagnosed brain tumor. And I somehow in my mind thought that advice was out there, all bound into a nice, book. I realized I would have to actually write that book myself after going through, the blood, sweat, and tears of the experience. But you want to have rules that can guide you. And I think in my family situation, I mean, I've been brought up to think, okay, if you follow the rules and you're a good person and you do all the things you're supposed to do, life is supposed to
work out somehow.
And I'm not sure what that means, just that you're going to have an easy life, that you're not going to have trauma, you're not going to have death in it. Like, it doesn't make much sense now, but there was some feeling that I had that our family was protected. Like, everyone else out there was, could have tragedy happen, but our family, we were doing everything the way we should. And it was like this curtain was raised of realizing how much, tragedy and loss is out there. And in fact, and then what you were talking about with bringing, actually acknowledging the death or acknowledging the illness and the severity of it is so important, because I've spoken at a lot of book clubs and different types of intimate gatherings, and people will go around the room and share what loss they've had in their life. And the number of people that had a loss of a parent or a sibling when they were much younger, so this could be 20, 30 years ago, and how there just wasn't as much transparency within the family even.
For sure.
Caused a lot of long-standing hurt, because they couldn't talk to the parents about the sibling loss because they were afraid that they were going to upset the parent.
Yes. Okay. And let's linger on that for a second, because that is something I think parents, it's helpful to understand that it's very common that kids won't necessarily share about their grief or what they're sad about or struggling about because they're afraid of upsetting their surviving parent.
Mhm.
Um, and it's like, I didn't know that because I didn't have any reason to know that. But just knowing that helps me to be aware that maybe I should poke a little. Maybe if something seems a little off, I should be the one to broach the subject and to send the message that the door is open to these conversations. And one of the things I've learned too is even if the kid doesn't want to talk then, I mean, hopefully they do, but if they don't, it's okay. It's not like for naught because you're still sending the message that the door is open. So maybe they want to talk tomorrow or next week or next month, but that sending that message is so important.
What did you experience with the kids' school during that period of time, either during the illness or after? Did they respond in any way?
Yeah. So the school community was very, very supportive. Much of that support took the logistical form. So everything I was mentioning about all the carpools, all the food, all that stuff, like so many parents in the school community rallied, and having my kids over if I had to be at the hospital, like, so providing that kind of safety net of logistics and like, because I couldn't manage everything. So they stepped in and that was huge. I would also say that, and it was a Catholic school. And so one of their traditions was to plant a tree on the playground or on the school grounds if a parent died. And somehow there were a number of parents who had died in recent years. I have no idea why. And so actually one of the things that my kids made them uncomfortable was that, after, well, actually you were talking about, so much focus, all of a sudden you were a public family. You were the family with the kid who died of the brain tumor. We were the family with the dad who was going to die or did die of the brain tumor, right? I couldn't walk around at the school without people, and they were super nice, right? But that certain head tilt, like, and they're like, and how are you? And I'm like, okay, I don't have the energy for this right now because I'm trying to pick up my kid and go to the store and whatever, right? There was so much, focus on us. And when he died, then the kids said that their friends, some of them didn't know what to say, so they didn't say anything. And then that was super awkward because they just wanted their friends to be normal. And even like the friends, they wanted to play video games or joke around on the playground or just do like regular stuff. But the other kids were like awkward, not knowing what to say. So then as time went by, that kind of started going back to normal. And then they did the tree planting ceremony like a couple of months later because it was get to be springtime. And all of a sudden the kids were all weird again. Because they brought all the kids in the 6th grade and the 3rd grade out, and they did the tree blessing and all the stuff and whatever with the tree, which reminded them all and put my kids front and center again.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, kids were weird again, and it lasted less long the second time.
Right. They want to be normal.
Yeah.
Kids very much want to be normal, and the pieces that that would bother my girls would be when, say, they'd be in French class. And the teacher there would be a unit on family terminology, right? Mom, dad, sister, brother. And the teacher would ask, how many siblings do you have?
Right.
And it was really difficult for them because everyone knew that their sister had died because they were in the same school. But how do they say, I have two, I have one, but one passed away, and that would really eat away at them. What I would do is, it's a hard enough question for a parent to answer. And I think we've learned at the beginning, we always said, I would always say, I have 3 daughters, 2 are living and 1 passed away. And I was very upfront about it. But for kids, it was different. I remember Rachel, who was 9 at the time, a friend of hers actually said to her something like, well, you're getting so much attention. My grandma just passed away. And so the kids were even like getting sometimes annoyed that they felt like she was getting the attention, and they were trying to compare it to their loss. And that was difficult. So I'm also thinking one other thing of how we set up in the kids' schools with the principal or the social worker, just this ability in those first couple of months after Laura died to say, hey, if either the kid really felt like they couldn't be in the classroom anymore, that things just got too emotional for them, that they could like ask the teacher to go to the principal's office or to go to the nurse's office to just kind of regroup. And I don't think they ever used that opportunity, but having that opportunity there, I'm pretty sure helped them psychologically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I think it's important for, maybe a broader point in that is that for parents not to assume that this teacher or the principal or the school necessarily knows what's going to be best for your kid. Not to assume, I just kind of assumed, oh, teachers know everything about kids. So they know about teaching them math, and they know about teaching them reading, and they know about if someone dies, what to do, and they know about if this happens, and like they just know all the kid stuff. Right. Well, it turns out that most teachers don't actually get any training whatsoever about grief and death and kids with dead parents or dead siblings. And so teachers, I think, and they want to support all the kids in their classroom. And I think that a parent coming in and sitting down with them can go a long way towards making everybody feel more at ease and more supported.
I agree. And it's been surprising to me that not only did teachers not get trained in grief and childhood grief, but nurses and doctors don't either, or psychologists really. I mean,
yeah,
there might be like
therapists.
one class or one session in these training or certification programs. And this is such a large part of what we're all dealing with now. I mean, especially in the wake of COVID, there was some study that 1 million extra people passed away during COVID. And if you take, 9 or 10 people that are affected by each of those deaths and times it out, you're talking like 10 million people who are extra people who are grieving on top of the regular people who are grieving. And
Right. Yeah.
It does seem like a whole larger education needs to get done in our society.
Right. For sure. As someone's mentioned in the comments, sometimes schools do group meetings with other kids. And I think that, like, I kind of wish that I had thought to go into the classroom maybe and talk with the kids in my kids' class, maybe before my kids came back, or maybe not, I'm not sure, but just to say, like, what questions do you have? And like, you're not sure what to say to your friend here who just lost their dad. Like, can we just talk about this? So it's not such a taboo thing,
But there's also this feeling like, oh, if we'd only had 20/20 vision.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And really it's like you're in this untenable situation that you never expected to be in. The rug's been pulled out from you and you're getting stress from all sorts of places.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
And then 5 years later, we're looking at ourselves going, well, I should have done this, and this, but that's just not how life works. And
oh, for sure.
Sometimes we can be so hard on ourselves. And I mean, I think just the fact that, you put one foot in front of the other and keep parenting is
oh, for sure,
achievement.
Yeah, for sure. And it is a fine line, right? Like, and I don't want to sound like I'm beating myself up, because what I think I'm doing, or what I hope I'm doing, is saying, in hindsight, if I'd known this, that would help, and that insight might help someone else who's facing that now or later, right?
It makes a lot of sense. Well, so you talk, there's this wisdom out there that kids are so resilient. What's your feeling about that? Like, do you think kids are resilient? Do you think it's there's an issue with us saying that and just assuming it as if we want them all to be resilient, therefore they are?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a wishful thinking in there, and also a bit of a too broad brush. I guess I would want to put qualifiers on it, like some kids are resilient, or kids might be resilient, or kids can be resilient, or kids are resilient with support, or right, like, because the reason is, I think too often I see or hear the kids are resilient as kind of a phrase that means don't worry about them, they'll be fine. Right. And that's not necessarily true. Some kids seem unaffected and bounce right back. Some kids may seem unaffected in the short term, but actually there's things festering. Like, for example, I interviewed a woman whose mom died when she was like 19, 18. And she was like, heads down, I'm going to college. I'm, super achieving. I'm going to achieve in my career. I'm going to get married. I'm going to have kids. I'm going to go. And everyone was like, you're so strong. You're so great. You're doing so great. And then when she was approaching like 42 or something, the age when her mom died, she got all these unexplained headaches, unexplained this and that, like medical, and all the tests were like, we don't see anything wrong with you. What's going on? And it turned out that it was an urgent care doctor that she'd gone in for like an ear infection or something. And somehow he asked about grief, and it unraveled this whole thing that when her mom died, when she was 18 or 19, and everybody thought that she was just resilient and just kept going, that actually it affected her tremendously. And it just didn't come out until she was 41, 42.
Okay. Well, I think the the misconception about grief is that we all, on news stories, it's all about closure. And we think that there's supposed to be an end date when we're not grieving anymore. And I think that's the piece that I've learned over these years is, it doesn't ever go away. It's not like you're going to ever forget that you had this loved one in your life. It's that you have to take that love or that grief and integrate it into your new identity. And that it's this like gradual process. And then the process doesn't go in a straight line. And even if it went in a straight line, you're different ages when you're processing it and you're different life stages. So I only can imagine what that's like for my girls who were 12 and 9, and now they're 20, almost 27 and 23. And I mean, I know that they're processing it in different ways, right? They're having to figure out at every stage of the game, do you tell your new college roommate that you had a sister that is no longer there?
Right. Because a typical chit chat question is, oh, where do you live? Oh, do you have siblings? Oh, whatever. Like, that's just like questions that get asked innocuously.
And so many times you're asked in so many different situations, what's your story? What's your life story? What's important to you? And I think even now they want to feel like that they don't want to have to bring that story along in every case, but I think it's always there as like an elephant in their mind.
Right.
Whether they have to keep remembering whether they told that person or didn't.
Right. Yeah. Well, and an interesting part about this too, is that with children, whether they lose a parent or lose a sibling, it turns out the kids re-grieve as they go through different developmental milestones. So if a kid is 2 when they've had a close loss, they can only grieve at a 2-year-old level of understanding. Once their brain starts upgrading and they get a 6-year-old level of understanding, then they kind of like re-grieve. And then a big thing is the puberty brain upgrades, that all of a sudden they re-grieve again. And so like I interviewed this woman whose daughter was 2 or 3 when her husband died. And when she was around 12, 13, she took her on a trip. I think she called it the dead dad trip or something. And they went to visit like his college and his hometown and, like stuff like that. Now for the mother, this loss of her husband had been a decade ago. So to her, she had done plenty of processing. She obviously, it's like it never goes away, like you said, but she was at a point where like her life was in a good place. But for the daughter, who also had the loss 10 years before, it was like the loss was fresh all over again, because she was re-grieving with that 12, 13-year-old level of understanding that she couldn't possibly have done earlier. And I think that's important for parents to understand too. And then again, it's like you say, there's the developmental aspects, and then there's the milestone aspect. So it's like you said, the new college roommate, it's the graduation, it's the wedding, it's the first baby, it's the also interestingly reaching the age that your parent was when they died, especially for a same-sex parent, like a son and when their father died, or a daughter and when their mother died. But that's even a stronger trigger sometimes. But it can apply to either parent too. And sometimes people have a percent, oh, well, my dad died at 50, so that's how long a life is. So if I'm 25, I must be middle-aged or something, like that.
Right. Well, what are some examples that you found that were helpful to your kids, or that are out there as resources for, kids who have lost a parent or a sibling, and there are camps out there, there's different support groups. Like,
Yeah.
what have you seen that works and where's more work needed?
Yeah, I got a million ideas on that. But actually, I have one more thing on the kids are resilient thing, if you don't mind me looping back to that real quick. It reminds me, I don't know if you've been watching that show that's on Apple TV right now. It's called Shrinking.
Yes.
Yeah, that I binged the whole 10 episodes. I'm like, where's the second season, right? Well, and so for people who haven't seen it, the main character is a widowed father. He's probably in his 40s, and he has a daughter who's in high school, and his wife has died within the past year, I think. And he is a therapist, and he has the other main characters are therapists in his practice, and it's a delightful show. And he is really struggling with the loss of his wife. And in fairly early in the series, and he's seen everything through his eyes, right? He's grieving, he's a widower, his wife died, he's seen his own pain. And the daughter says something very profound, and I wanted to stop it and like write it down, and I might go back and look for it. And she said, you're so the daughter, the high school daughter, you're so focused on yourself. This didn't just happen to you. This happened to me too. I lost my mother, and this happened to us. Our family lost mom. And I was like, that is so profound, because I think that people, I think that he, maybe others, were kind of thinking, oh, the daughter's resilient, and she seemed to be capable and bright and competent and, have her act together in some respects. And she was struggling, and people weren't recognizing that. And I think that's the danger of writing off, oh, kids are resilient. They'll be fine. So back to your question about resources. I actually grabbed off my shelf before we started because I knew I couldn't reach over here and grab it, although I could pull down about 20 different books here. This one, I don't know if you've heard of this, Giving Hope, conversations with children about illness, death, and loss. And actually, they might be fascinating to have on this discussion series sometime soon. Elena Lister and Michael Schwartzman, and one is a psychiatrist and one is a psychologist. And this, I said to them, this book just came out like last year, maybe. This was like the book that I was looking for when I went to Amazon and typed in, like, where's the book that's going to tell me how to do this? Right? How do I talk to my kids? How do I navigate this? How do I, like, what do I say? And I think this book is fabulous. And actually, it might be also interesting for you to talk with Elena. She got into this work because one of her daughters died in a grade school age 7 or 8 years old, maybe 9 years old. And her other daughter, I think it's the older one who died, and she and her husband ended up going into the school when the older daughter was very sick. And I think she hadn't died yet, but it was clear that it was terminal. And they went in because they needed to support the younger daughter. And those kids had questions, and kids were weird and didn't know how to interact with the younger daughter, the healthy daughter. And they went in and like started having these conversations. And I think they went to the principal and they said, can we come in? Because this is getting too awkward and our younger daughter needs support here.
It takes a lot of proactivity, if that's a word, a proactive nature to just sort of, it's the same thing of like role modeling what your children need and what you need as the grieving person. Like, right. I remember I'd get these looks of pity at Starbucks because I would be running into parents of children who had been in Laura's grade, and now their children were living and Laura had passed away, and they were so embarrassed. They didn't know what to say, what to do. Yeah. And I would have to actually say to them, oh, how's Jojo doing or whatever. And they would say, oh, she's working at the store down the block. That's, and I would say, oh, Laura loved the jeans there. And and once I mentioned Laura's name, it was like this relief you could tell on their face. And then they could talk about Laura because I'd given them permission. Yeah. And I think that's important to like know what you need. And I needed to have them talk about Laura. Right. But I know we could go on forever with this discussion. I can't believe it's 10 to 1. We still have a good amount of time. We have like 20 more minutes left, but what are some questions that people have that if you want to put them into the chat, we can try to get to them?
And while we're waiting for questions, because I've only shared the one resource so far, I wanted to make sure, because you asked about camps and grief centers, there are grief centers, it turns out, in many communities around the country. And they're, kids and family grief centers. Some are smaller, some are larger, depending on their size and whatever. They have different programming, but generally speaking, they have grief support groups for different ages of kids, like little kids, medium-sized kids, teenagers. Many of them have groups for parents. Some of them have groups for adults that are not connected to kids in the program, just adults in general. And some of them have just adult groups for parents of kids in the programs. Some of them also have young adult groups, which is a tricky age group for support. And some of them, if they're larger centers, sometimes they have like specific groups for suicide loss or specific groups for COVID loss or other kinds of things. So they'll meet once or twice a month, and they'll do things that help basically the participants learn how to remember their dead sibling or parent.
Right.
And how to talk about them and how to process it. And, some of the benefit, I think, when we're talking about kids being weird at school or not knowing how to react, or people in Starbucks not knowing how to react, is that you're in a group with people who kind of gets it. And even if the person next to you had a different loss or a different circumstance, everybody kind of gets it. And it's not, you're not the only weird kid with a dead dad, right? Everybody there has somebody who's died that they care about. So there's those groups, which generally, they either run year round or they run like on a school year basis. Sometimes those centers do programs in the schools as well, and maybe work with the school counselors to identify kids who've had close losses and pull them into some kind of group at school. There are also grief camps, which are like, 3 or 4 day kind of camps. Aluna runs a lot of them, ELUNA. In cities across the country. And, it's kind of a mix of like camp activities, like, a ropes course and a campfire and a whatever, I don't know, whatever they do at camp. And grief activities, making the picture frames and the candles and doing things, right? So there's that. And so in terms of finding a grief center, there's 2 really good search places. And one is the National Alliance for Children's Grief. So if you go to childrengrieve.org, one of the items on their menu is like find grief support, and you can search, because all those grief centers are members of the National Alliance for Children's Grief. Like it's an organization of members of those kind of centers. And then the other one is dougy.org, DOUGY.org. And they are located in Portland, Oregon, so if you're in Oregon, call them for sure. But also they're a national center, and they have a ton of information on their website. So as a starting point, free downloads, guides for this, whatever. But also they have a lookup tool where you can put in your zip code, because it turns out they train a lot of the centers and have trained them for years. Like Dougie's been around for a long time. And so they have a really good lookup tool there where you can put in your zip code and find support in your location.
Those are great. I mean, it's great that you can give a couple of these really, really good resources, because there's so much out there, and it's nice to have some kind of a filter to say these are good resources for a wide variety of things.
Yeah, for sure.
But so I wanted to go through a couple of the questions, and one of them was, did you find that your kids saw and processed things that you had no idea about?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I think that goes back to the idea of, kids and maybe not wanting to upset their parents and not letting on what's going on. I definitely had things that I didn't find out about with one of my kids until much later. In fact, I'm constantly saying, well, I didn't know that at the time. Like, why didn't you tell me that? And now we're kind of at a point where we can talk a little more openly about some of that. But I don't want to get into too many specifics because I don't have permission to share some of it. And I want to respect their permission, privacy, but definitely there were things where, a lot of internal, some of it was trauma, I think, right? That wasn't being let on to me at the time. And this is where me educating myself now and saying, ooh, I could have poked at some things or whatever. But I just mentioned trauma. That reminded me, actually, this was super interesting to me too, because for me, coming into this, like I said, as a regular parent and as a person who worked at an IT company, right? I wasn't a whatever psychiatrist or something. I guess I thought that trauma, like I've heard of trauma in the context of, PTSD from a war situation, right? That's a thing that could cause trauma. And I could imagine, that there could be some kinds of deaths that would be traumatic. Like if you were part of a murder scene and the person you love was murdered and you got out somehow, and there could be trauma there. That seems inherently traumatic, right? And you can imagine there'd be other scenarios like that seem easy to intuit that it might be traumatic. But to me, a death from an illness that went on for 8 months and then someone died, was sad and was terrible and was disorienting and all these things. I didn't imagine that it might be traumatic. Because from my perspective, I was like, cancer, people die. Not all people die of cancer. Some people die of cancer. Lots of people die of this cancer. It just, I didn't understand how it could be traumatic. And it turns out, this was super interesting. Trauma is when it overwhelms that individual's ability to cope with the situation. So it's not that the event itself, the type of loss, is inherently traumatic for all people, and another one is inherently not traumatic for anyone. It's depending on the facts and the circumstances and that individual's ability to cope with what has happened. That is where trauma comes in. And so one person might be traumatized by an event that the next person is not traumatized by.
Totally agree with you. And that's like a whole other topic that I talk about in my book of, what we experienced was definitely, I would say, traumatic. And the reason that I really was pushed to write this book, I needed to write the book, is I learned about, something called post-traumatic growth, which is a topic that there's research that says that 40 to 70, the majority of people, 40 to 70% of people who've experienced a traumatic loss will gain some type of wisdom from that loss. Or, they'll and learning that term really made me feel a lot less guilty that here we could have lost our daughter, our parents' worst nightmare, and yet we still were surviving and we had gained some meaning and purpose from the loss. Not that it was easy and but through the pain of the struggle of going through the loss, we'd kind of come out on some other side,
right,
where we now had deeper friendships or learned about the fragility of life and we're more compassionate or more understanding of other people's problems.
Yeah, perspectives that you didn't have before.
And so, I mean, there are a lot of caveats with that, and it's not like a silver lining kind of theory where it's all rose-colored glasses, but it's a feeling of, I wanted to share this message that if people in grief see these glimmers of light, if they feel like they're doing okay, even better than maybe they expected, that we as people and as caregivers should nurture that and be okay acknowledging it.
Yeah. That's such an important point. And that's where I think that getting comfortable with the "and" is important to me. Like it can be terrible and tragic and wish it didn't happen and everything negative regarding the fact that Laura died and that Dennis died. And also, without changing that statement at all, it can also be fulfilling and incredible and amazing and wonderful that we're each doing the things we're doing now. Right. And you don't have to, it's not like in order for one to be right, the other has to be like, you don't have to be like, this was okay, so therefore this is okay. Like, no, this can be terrible and this can be good. And if you just get comfortable with the fact that you don't have to somehow make those fit together, it's all good.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I always think about them as two different rocks. You can be happy and sad, but you can put them in your same hand at the same time, and they don't
That's
have
a good
to
analogy
merge together. So there was another question about like when I was standing in line at the Starbucks, what reaction would I have been looking for? And I would say that I would want to be able to have a discussion, like a real discussion about what I was going through. And I know that's not easy. And I knew that I had to kind of start that because we're not trained as just, average people who've never experienced death to kind of get into that conversation. But
Right.
what I do like to give as takeaways, and we're getting to that point where I'd love to be able to just do a couple of takeaways about grief in general, that I always like to leave people with is, one of them is mention the person's name, which is so important. And people are so afraid to bring up the deceased person's name for fear that like I would cry or that I would get upset, or like you would be reminding me that my daughter had died, which is
Right.
ridiculous, right?
As if you forgot, right?
Exactly. So that's the one thing, is definitely bring up the person's name and tell a story or remind them of some fun thing, some relationship that they had that was special. Because there were no more memories to make with that person. So anytime that you can remind the griever of a special memory, that's great. The other thing I would say is to show up and not ignore the person. It's really hard because it's very uncomfortable. Listen and don't judge how they're reacting to the death. And the last piece is, don't try to fix it, because I knew that, that no one else could bring back Laura, but my friends all wanted to bring back Laura. And that's the reason that they were uncomfortable in talking to me. And so it's like, you just have to, you can't, I didn't want my friends to ignore me. I had already lost my daughter. I didn't want to lose my friends too.
Yeah. And that's a powerful point.
And the last piece that I always like to tell people is the question, the very innocuous sounding question of how are you doing?
Yeah.
Really hard. And but it's a question we ask people all the time. And how could I respond to that question? I could not say great, because my daughter had died and that would have been ridiculous. And I didn't want to say horrible, because then the person wouldn't want to be around me and would kind of run off. So I've learned that just by adding a time period, like how are you doing this morning? It makes all the difference in the world, because you can start the conversation.
Oh, for sure. And I'm glad you brought this up. I actually wrote a whole piece about this, because I was like, and I'm finally, so in our culture, how are you is kind of a throwaway question. It's almost like hello, right? But when during those 8 months, the dentist was sick, it became this existential question. I'd run into somebody and they'd say, how are you? And a million things would go through my head. Like, first of all, who's asking? How much do they already know? Like, how closely are they following along? How much do I want to share with them? And then even if I did, somebody I might want to share with, how am I anyway? Because it felt like there's so many levels to the question. Like, existentially, maybe I was horrible. And on some logistical level, maybe I was stressed. And on some physical level, maybe I was okay because I actually slept well last night. Or I just ate a nice meal, so I'm not hungry, or, I had enough water, so I'm not dehydrated or something. So, and so all those calculations would go through my head in the split second. And I'd usually end up kind of sighing and being like, fine, which didn't help me, didn't help them, didn't help us connect, didn't help anybody. Right. But for the longest time, that was all I could do. And, so finally now, it's 8 years later, I can tweet it as a throwaway question again. Right. But for a long time, that was really, that question just, I don't even know what the word is. It was just impossible. And I agree with you. How are you today? Or something like that is somehow that one little word
much better
makes the question so much less hard.
Okay, so Jenny, I've done many of these conversations, and this time has gone by so much quicker than any other time, in my opinion.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
It's very good. I feel like we could have taken 20 different directions and had just as much conversation on each one of the points. Yeah. And there is an ending time that I want to respect everyone's time. But in the chat box, I am going to put some links that that Jenny sent to me. But don't worry about if you can't access them right now, because for everyone that is here or who's registered, I'm going to be sending out the Zoom link and all of these different links as well, so you can kind of peruse them at your leisure. I want to thank you, Jenny. Is there any parting thought that you'd like to share with us?
Like you said, we could keep going forever, because there's like a whole bunch of million other directions to go with this. I think that one thing I would say is it's okay not to have all the answers when you're talking with your kids, and it's still okay to have those conversations. And that's one of the things I think I also didn't understand. I felt like, I didn't want to get into those conversations if I didn't have answers. And a lot of kid questions are easy to answer. Why do I have to wear my seatbelt? Why can't I have dessert before dinner? Right? Those have answers. Right? You got to wear your seatbelt because you don't want to die if we get in a car crash. I mean, you might not phrase it that way to your little kid, but essentially there's an answer for that question. But when you started to get into this whole topic, that, there's questions like, what's going to be the person's prognosis or something that you might not have an answer to because nobody knows yet. And it's okay to share like that you don't know, and share, this is what I do know. This is when I expect to find out more. We're having another scan next week and I'll let you know when I have more information. Or maybe the kid's asking how cancer works or something, and that's something you can Google to find some like factual stuff they're curious about, right? So there's that. And then there's the kind of more existential questions like, why did dad have to die? Why did my sister have to die? There's no answer to that question. And what I've learned, so prior me would have been like, avoid that question at all costs, right? Like, I can't handle that. I can't, what I've learned is that it's okay not to have an answer. And it's still an opportunity to connect around the emotion behind the question. So like, I don't know. It sucks. I miss him. And engage them in a discussion, like, what do they miss about him, or what do they remember? What's their favorite memory of that? Like using it as an unanswerable question as a leverage point into discussing the emotion that's really behind the question. And I think that, so knowing that it's okay not to have all the answers, I think is a really important point for parents when thinking about talking with their kids.
That's really, really great. I think both of us, we both would very much like this conversation to keep going, and that I think we both of us love the fact that so many people came on and are so interested in this topic, and we are both very happy to keep in touch with any of you. And if there are speaking opportunities or people that you think that either of our books would be helpful for, we all know people in our life that are struggling in different ways, even if we're not right now. Even if you're not struggling, someone else might be. And so passing along this information is really helpful and really makes us feel good to know that our information can help other people. And I'm going to be having another Permission to Thrive conversation. I'm not exactly sure right when, but I will definitely keep in touch with you, and you can follow Jenny with her widowed, what's it called? The Widowed podcast.
Here we go, right here. The Widowed Parent podcast. Yeah. And then the book is called Future Widow.
Yeah. And I know Jenny's doing a couple other projects that you can learn more about in the email that we send out. So again, I appreciate all of you being with us today, and I hope we answered a lot of your questions, and we'll just hopefully we'll see you next time.
Great. So, thank you so much, Susan, for having me. And thank you everybody for joining. It's been great. I wish we could continue indefinitely, but yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Jenny. Take care. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye-bye.